The goal of this video is to practice finding some probabilities using the z-table, similar to what we did in the previous few videos. What I usually recommend doing for students is to actually try this example on your own first. So if you haven't already done so, pausing the video at this time, working all three parts, and then coming back to see if you match. If you prefer, you can just work one part at a time and then watch the video to see if you did that part correctly, and then move on to the next part. So again, if you would like, feel free to pause the video here and work part A at least. Now first we can see for part A if we have the same picture. So my mean was 156,000 and the standard deviation was 23,600. So each of my steps you see here is that distance of 23,600. In part A, it asks for less than $190,000. So here's roughly where $190,000 is. And since it says less than, we're going to shade left. Now a few things we could actually go ahead and talk through about this picture, remembering how this scale relates to our z-score calculation. Right at 156,000, that would correspond to a z-score of 0. Anytime I be to the left of that value, my z-score would be negative. Anytime I'm to the right of that value, my z-score would be positive. So I know at this point that this z-score will be positive. More specifically, it's going to be between positive 1 and positive 2, since it falls between 1 and 2 standard deviations above the mean. Also, I can tell from my picture that my answer should be greater than 50%. Again, this is using that 156,000 as our reference point. If I had just everything to the left of that value shaded, that would be exactly 50%. So I can tell, since I have this additional piece here, that my answer is going to be more than 50%. Finally, I can also tell if I'm going to need to use a rule when I go to the table. So since my picture is shaded left and our z-table is also shaded left, I know I'm not going to need to use a rule when I go to the table, or in a sense, when I go to the table, that's going to be able to give me my answer. So first here, after I did my z calculation, you can see that my z was positive, and more specifically is between positive 1 and 2, just like I knew it should be. Next, I'm going to take that z value of 1.44 and take it to my z-table. So the 1.4, the first decimal, tells me the row to go to, and that 0.04 tells me the second decimal place to go to. That corresponds to a value of 0.9251 for our table. Now, since the table is shaded left, and so is my picture, that 0.9251 is actually my answer. And notice that that is also bigger than the 0.5 or 50% as we knew it should be. Last, we need to interpret our probability. So then we are able to say that the probability that a randomly selected house in this town has a value less than $190,000 is 0.9251 or 92.51%. How this value could be useful to someone is suppose that your budget for a house was $190,000. So what you could see from this value is about 92.5% of the houses are going to be within your budget. So this is probably going to be a good area for you to look for a house if $190,000 is your budget. Now again, if you haven't already done so, you can pause the video here and work part B. Now we can first look at our picture for part B. So notice that first, all the black numbers along the bottom here are the exact same as they were above, since the mean and standard deviation did not change. What did change is this time I want to find being more than $140,000. So $140,000 falls between this 132 and this 156. And since it says more than, that makes me shade right. Now talking through the same idea as we did with part A. First, looking at my value of my z-score. So this time the value falls below the mean, which means that my z is going to be negative. More specifically, it's going to be between -1 and 0. So it's not going to be way too far on the negative side, but it's still going to be a negative value. Next, comparing my answer to 50%, I can again tell that my answer should be more than 50%. Because if I had everything to the right of this $156,000 shaded, that would be exactly 50%. So I have this additional piece here that lets me know my answer will be more than 50%. Finally, since my picture is shaded right and our table instead is shaded to the left, I know I'm going to have to use that first rule, or shaded right rule, as I'm actually calculating the probability for this question. So first, doing my z-score calculation, I can see that I got negative 0.68, which is between that -1 and 0, as I knew it should be. Next, we're going to take that value to the table. As we take the negative 0.68 to the table, we should find 0.2483. Again, we should be on the negative side of our z table here. Here's our negative 0.6 row. And our 0.08 column is the second to last one here, corresponding to this value of 0.2483. Now recall that when I found this value, it's actually telling me what's to the left of that value. So this 24.83% is technically what is to the left of that value. So when I actually do my probability calculation, that's why I have to do that 1 minus rule, since we are shaded to the right, giving us an overall probability of 0.7517, which is now more than the 50%, like I knew it should be. So again, when do I use that 1 minus rule? Whenever we're shaded right. All right, of course, last thing we have to do is interpret our probability. So then we can say the probability that a randomly selected house in this town has a value that is more than $140,000 is 0.7517, or 75.17%. Last problem here again to try on your own first is part C. All right, so first looking at this picture, again the black scale along the bottom is the same as it was before because the mean and standard deviation have not changed. But this time we want to find between $135,000 and $185,000. So I just first found where those values go along my scale. Since it says between, I shaded the values between. Now this time, since we have two numbers along the bottom here, we're going to have two z values that we're going to calculate. The one corresponding to $135,000 is going to be negative since it is below the mean. More specifically, it's going to be between -1 and 0. The $185,000 will be positive since it's going to be above the mean, but more specifically, it's going to be between +1 and +2. For the between ones, when one value falls below the mean and one falls above the mean, sometimes it's hard to tell exactly what your answer is going to be. So you'll notice that I only use this reference of 50% for the ones that only have the one value along the bottom. The other question that we can answer is how we're going to have to go to the table. So this time, since we're shaded between, we're going to be using that between rule. So first, let's calculate our z-scores. So for my z-score calculations, my $185,000 corresponded to a z of +1.23, which was between that +1 and 2, as I knew it should be. The z for $135,000 turned out to be -0.89, which is between the -1 and 0, as I knew it should be as well. Now next, in order to use that between rule, the first thing we have to do is take both of these values to the table. So we're going to look up that +1.23 in the table and that -0.89 in the table. When we look up that +1.23 in the table, we should find 0.8907. Which is right here corresponding to that z of positive 1.23. When we look at that negative 0.89 in the table, we should find this 0.1867. So again, we're going to look at both numbers in the table first. Now, to actually calculate our probability, since it's a between rule, we're going to be subtracting those two probabilities. Because this 0.8907 gave me everything below that 185, which included this extra piece here that I don't want. So we're going to subtract off this piece, which is what this 0.1867 corresponds to in the table. So we're going to get an overall probability of 0.7040. Of course, the last thing we need to do here is interpret that probability. So then we can say the probability that a randomly selected house in this town has a value that is between $135,000 and $185,000 is 0.7040, or that would be 70.4%. So now you've done an example of using the shaded left rule, shaded right, as well as the between. And so hopefully you feel more comfortable with using the table to calculate probabilities. In the next video, we're still going to be using the table, but we're going to do something a little bit different with it.